The carbon cycle is a rather important concept in AP Environmental Science, so let's go ahead and study this one. So CO2, or carbon dioxide, it's a natural component of our atmosphere, and it tends to cycle in and out of the atmosphere in a process called the carbon cycle. And it's not very abundant, particularly it comprises less than 0.04% of the atmosphere overall, but it's very important because it does a great deal to regulate Earth's temperature, as we'll see later on in the year. So the process by which it moves in and out of the atmosphere and other parts of the world, like the ocean and the land, is called the carbon cycle. And so in the carbon cycle, basically we have chemical means, we have mechanical means, and we have biological means for moving carbon from component to component of the system. So the best way to approach, I think, is to just start from the idea of, well, what is it that could take carbon out of the atmosphere? But there's basically two ways that carbon gets removed from the atmosphere. It gets removed through photosynthesis in plants that take carbon dioxide and use it for photosynthesis, and also diffuses or leaks into the world's oceans. But then there's a number of ways that it comes back out into the atmosphere. So respiration, when things eat that glucose molecules, they turn it back into carbon dioxide. Just as carbon dioxide can diffuse into the ocean, it can diffuse back out of it. But then there's other processes that are pretty important, most notably burning. So if we burn things like wood or oil or natural gas, these are carbon compounds, and when we burn them, we combine them with oxygen, turn it back into carbon dioxide, which goes in the atmosphere. Another one that's pretty important for carbon dioxide is volcanic activity. So here's just a diagram of the system. I don't really want to focus on it too much right now. I want to go on to the next thing here and talk about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is a process I'm sure we're quite familiar with now. We've studied it a bit already this year, and you've studied it in past years. Basically, plants take carbon dioxide, which is atmospheric carbon dioxide, bring it in through the stomata of their leaves. They bring water in through their root systems. They take energy from the sun and stitch these low energy molecules together to make this high energy molecule called glucose, and the process release some oxygen in the process of doing so. So essentially, plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and fix it into their tissues. Now, cellular respiration does just the opposite. So in cellular respiration, we're going to take this molecule glucose, combine it with oxygen, use that oxygen to break it apart, and turn it back into carbon dioxide and water, which are both released into the atmosphere. So all organisms engage in respiration. It's not just animals, it's also plants, it's fungus, it's bacteria, it's these things in the soil. So there's lots of respiration going on, and respiration always puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's worth noting that the process of combustion or burning is, in most cases, if what we're burning is a carbon compound, it's virtually identical to cellular respiration in terms of the products involved. So basically, respiration takes glucose, combines with oxygen, and converts into carbon dioxide and water and releases energy. But if I take, say, gasoline is basically C8H18. I combine that with oxygen, and what comes out is carbon dioxide and water. It's the exact same process. Point is, respiration and burning all produce carbon dioxide and release it into the atmosphere. It's worth noting that decomposition is a process that we tend to ignore around us. It's one we don't focus on very often. But when things decompose, basically all that means is they're getting devoured. They're getting consumed by things that we don't really notice, like by fungi and bacteria primarily, and also detritivore animals. And these things all respire. And so that means they take the carbon compounds present in an old log or a dead deer, and they basically eat it and respire and turn it back into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So let's just think of it this way. In photosynthesis, this is a small example of the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide comes into the plant during photosynthesis, and then when the plants need to use that glucose, they release the carbon, respiration puts that carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere, and it completes this cycle. Now, we'll look at this in terrariums, all right? But now what happens, though, is usually plants engage in more photosynthesis than they do respiration. So there's remember that the NPP is usually a positive value, that they engage in more photosynthesis than they do in respiration. So what tends to happen is plants form what's called a carbon trap or a carbon sink. They bring in a large amount of carbon dioxide compared to what they breathe out. And where is this missing carbon? I brought in all this carbon. Where did it go? It went into making the cellulose of the plant tissue. So what we find then is you can think of plants, growing plants, as trapping carbon or storing carbon, or we call this a carbon sink. So let's look at an old plant. So we have a 500-year-old tree. A 500-year-old tree is basically a carbon sink that's been operating for 500 years. So basically, this tree contains, and this tree is actually probably more than 500 years old, it contains carbon that was captured out of the atmosphere over 500 years ago, up till last year. So it's just been continually accruing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in this massive trunk that it has in the form of cellulose. Well, now it's interesting to note that coal and oil and natural gas, these are all basically essentially carbon traps of their own because they're basically plants that didn't rot. All right, so basically, coal and oil are formed when photosynthetic plants die, or any kind of organisms die, and they end up in a low oxygen environment where aerobic respiration is not possible. And so the carbon that's in them doesn't get respired and turned back into carbon dioxide. So it can't go away. It just gets stored in there. And what happens is over millions of years through heat and pressure, the glucose and the cellulose gets turned into other things. But still the carbon remains. Other carbon compounds are formed out of these cellulose and sugars. So let's just talk about coal. So for coal, basically, you should associate coal with swamps. You have plants, trees primarily, that grew in swamps. When they fell over into this water, the water had high acidity, it had low oxygen, not very conducive to bacterial growth. So it couldn't be consumed. So nothing respired and released the carbon dioxide, just stayed in there. So over time, it gets buried under dirt and mud. It gets covered with water. It gets compressed, and eventually, it gets through heat and pressure. It gets turned into coal. Coal is just trees that are 300 million years old, right? So they're just this really old carbon sink. Oil and natural gas are very similar, but instead of being made from coastal trees that fell into swamps, they're from marine environments. So basically, you have planktonic organisms that live in the nearshore environments, phytoplankton, zooplankton. They fall into nearshore environments where there's a lot of mud. Similar to coal, they get buried in mud under heat and pressure. The cellulose and the sugars in them get converted into, in this case, into oil and natural gas, and it just stays there for a long time. So basically, coal and oil are just very, very, very old photosynthesis, right? Now, moving on to other parts of the carbon cycle, the ocean, it turns out, not the atmosphere, but the ocean is the main sink of carbon dioxide on our planet. 93% of the carbon dioxide on our planet is actually in our oceans. And the way it moves in and out of the oceans is primarily through a process called diffusion. So basically, if there's basically the partial pressure of carbon dioxide pushes it into the water, and then if the partial pressure in the water is greater than the atmosphere, it gets pushed back out. So what we find is when water is cold, the pressure in the water is low, so carbon dioxide goes into cold water. So near the poles, the ocean tends to absorb carbon dioxide. Near the equators, where the water is warm water, it heats up the gases in the water and pushes them back out. So the atmosphere sort of breathes in and out carbon dioxide all the time. But when carbon dioxide rather enters water, it gets converted into this thing here called carbonic acid. And carbonic acid, the carbon is now in this carbonate ion rather than in CO2. And what happens there is that many marine animals have evolved a way of building skeletons in shells by doing this. They take the carbonate that formed when carbon dioxide went into the water, they combine it with calcium ions, which are present in the sea, and they turn it into this thing right here. They turn it into calcium carbonate right here. And calcium carbonate is not water soluble. So it's this very strong, durable material. But once it gets put in there, that again forms a carbon sink. A shell has all this carbon that was originally part of the atmosphere and will just stay in that shell until something happens to that shell. The shell basically has to get melted or dissolved. Now, what happens is over time, shells and other dead things, they form these marine deposits. And they build up. If you've ever been snorkeling on a coral reef, you might have seen this. It forms a substance called limestone. So limestone, again, is this carbon sink. But this carbon sink, it has carbon that came out of the atmosphere millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of years, even billions of years ago. So it's this very long carbon sink. So apart from the atmosphere, our major reservoirs of carbon would be the ocean, which is the biggest. Soils are the second largest. There's a lot of organic debris in soils, old plant matter in soils. Growing forests are another big one. Coal, oil, natural gas, and limestone. These are all the places where carbon gets stored. Now let's just think about this in terms of a time scale. If you eat a piece of fruit, say an apple, you eat it and then you respire the the carbon that was taken out of the atmosphere earlier in that season, right? So it's, it went in early in the season, comes out later in the season when you respire. If you burn wood, now I have a tree. It was 20 years old, so I'm taking maybe 100 years old. So I'm taking carbon that was stored for 100 years and then putting it back in the atmosphere when I burn it. Because remember, combustion is the same thing as respiration. When I take gasoline and burn it, I'm taking carbon that was taken out of the atmosphere tens of millions to hundreds of millions of years ago and putting it back out in the atmosphere. And then a volcano, when it erupts, it has basically limestone that got melted, and so it's releasing carbon dioxide that could easily have been stored a billion years ago. Now, that means there's two different carbon cycles that we talk about. We talk about the fast cycle and the slow cycle. The fast cycle basically involves things that don't involve rock material. Okay, so we're talking about things that are carbon that's moving in and out of the atmosphere in the lifespan of an organism. And the oldest organisms are trees. So we'll be really generous to say 10,000 years. I don't know if any trees actually make it to be that old, but we'd say anything less than that, you're operating within what's called the fast carbon cycle. So basically things moving in and out of organisms. But then the slow, and that includes the seawater, okay? But then the slow carbon cycle, basically, this is long term. This is very slow, obviously in the name. That means more than 10,000 years. We're talking hundreds of millions, billions of years. So basically, this means that the carbon's gotten turned into rock material, coal or oil or limestone. And the way it's pushed through the system is through the tectonic movements of the crust, which are very, very slow, centimeters per year. And so it takes millions of years, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years to move this through to where it melts in a volcano, and that volcano erupts and carries that carbon back out into the atmosphere. So that's called the slow carbon cycle. All right, so basically we have the fast carbon cycle, diffusion, things going in and out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and respiration, decomposition, and so on, forest fires. But if it moves down and becomes part of limestone or fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, now it's part of the slow cycle. And basically it's slowly going to have to be pushed through this until it gets to a volcano and comes back out. And that can take many, 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 many years. All right, thanks for watching.